The sirens that signaled a new trial rolled across the training grounds in a rising hum, a sound like metal singing underwater. Cadets poured out of dormitory modules onto the red gravel of the assembly plaza, uniforms flashing in the hard white light of Station Helix's artificial sun. Evan jogged with the crowd, cinching the cuffs of his jacket, his breath puffing faintly in the chilly air system. Around him, alien cadets moved in tight clusters by species, wings folded tight or frills pressed flat, sensory tendrils twitching in anxious anticipation. The harsh cliffs of the canyon training zone towered beyond the transparent dome, jagged silhouettes against the star-scattered sky. For most of them, the sight meant dread. For him, it felt like a promise. He slipped into formation near the front, next to Ziri, a slender cadet with luminous skin and 4 dark eyes that never seemed to blink. She shifted her weight from one two-toed foot to the other, the webbing between her fingers flicking nervously. "You are smiling again," she said softly, her translator band flattening her melodic native speech into crisp basic. "That usually means something terrifying is about to happen." Evan laughed under his breath. "Come on, it is not that bad. Last trial was fine." "Last trial involved walking across a swamp that tried to digest us," she reminded him. "You called it fun." The murmur of the plaza dimmed as a line of instructors strode onto the raised platform. At the center walked Commander Rule, a broad-shouldered veteran from a high-gravity world, his dark uniform immaculate, insignia gleaming. His presence had a weight that seemed to tug every spine a little straighter. He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked over the assembled cadets, eyes as sharp as sensor arrays. "Cadets," he began, voice amplified until it vibrated in Evan's chest. "Welcome to the 7th survival evaluation of this cycle." A low ripple went through the crowd. 7th meant the exam sequence was more than half complete, and failure now would erase months of work. Evan felt the tension around him like static, but his own heartbeat quickened for a different reason. He loved this part, the not knowing, the sudden unfolding of problems that had not existed a minute before. "Today's environment," Commander Rule continued, gesturing toward the distant cliffs, "will be the canyon zone. You are already familiar with its terrain from previous exercises. Vertical drops, unstable ledges, local wildlife, unpredictable thermal currents. You have navigated portions of it in teams, with full packs and anchor gear." A few cadets relaxed visibly. Familiar ground always offered comfort. Rule let that feeling hang for a moment, then shattered it. "This time," he said, "each of you will receive one standard survival rope. No packs, no grapplers, no powered gear, no cutting tools, nothing else." Silence spread outward from the platform like a slow wave. Evan felt the shift in the air as cadets absorbed the words, disbelief flashing across faces and scales and carapaces. Only one rope. No harnesses, no cleats, no pitons, no drones. Ziri's frills pressed even flatter against her skull. "Only a line?" she whispered. "No anchors? No adhesion pads?" "A rope is an anchor if you use it right," Evan replied automatically. His mind was already spinning, imagining knots and loops, friction hitches and prusicks, improvised harnesses and hauling systems. The instructors had just handed him a puzzle he had been training for his whole life without even realizing it. At home, rope had meant sailing rigs, tree houses, emergency rescue drills his father had insisted on. Here, it was a language most of the others barely spoke. Commander Rule inclined his head, and an assistant rolled out a cart piled with coiled ropes, each a dull gray length of synthetic fiber that could withstand enormous loads and temperature extremes. "Your objective remains straightforward," Rule said. "You will enter at Canyon Ingress Point 3, traverse the zone, and retrieve a signal beacon located at a designated coordinate on the far side. You must then return to the extraction point with the beacon. Time limit, 3 standard hours. Your performance will be evaluated on speed, safety, resourcefulness, and cooperative conduct." A taller insectoid cadet in the back raised a limb. "Instructor, With respect, how are we to traverse a multi-level canyon with a single rope and no anchor devices? Rule regarded him for a moment. This is a test of problem-solving and adaptability, Cadet 3. The canyon will not change to suit you. You must change to suit it. Evan felt a smile tug at his lips again. That sounded exactly like something his mother would have said about an unsympathetic mountain trail. Several other cadets began whispering, some in annoyance, some in panic. He caught fragments of complaints from a group of winged trainees who preferred controlled glides to climbing. Our wings are useless in those thermals. We will be blown into the rock faces. One rope will not stop a fall from that height. The doubts swirled through the plaza. Evan understood the fear. Without mechanical help, the canyon's sheer walls and sudden drops turned into death traps. But he also saw something else, something that made his fingers itch. Rope meant options, and options meant control. Rule gestured, and a holographic projection of the canyon flared to life above the platform, rotating slowly. Ledges, pillars, and ravines glowed in wireframe detail. A blinking marker indicated the beacon's location on a narrow outcrop, halfway up a vertical wall near the far end of the zone. The path there looked like nonsense at first glance. Broken shelves, knife-edge ridges, a separated pillar of stone that forced a crossing over open air. Perfect. You will enter singly, Rule continued. Staggered intervals, determined by your current ranking. No shared ropes, no trading equipment. You may share information verbally, but every cadet is responsible for solving the challenge with the resource issued to him or her. If you lose your rope, you are disqualified and must await retrieval from the safety drones. A few cadets flinched at the word disqualified. Evan clenched his jaw. Losing the rope would mean treating it like a single-use tool instead of a companion. He had no intention of letting that happen. Ziri exhaled slowly beside him. I do not like this, she said. I have climbed with magnet pads and anchored lines since my first training year. My people do not trust simple cords. They burn. They fray. They break at the worst moments. Evan glanced at her. Not if you know how to treat them. This kind is better than anything I had back home. You can load it, retie it, even strip it if you need smaller cords. It will take more abuse than our hands will. She looked at him with all four eyes, trying to decide whether he was reassuring her or only himself. You sound pleased, she accused. Please tell me you are not about to enjoy this. I might enjoy it a little, he admitted. One rope is a lot of rope if you know what to do with it. The line shuffled forward as instructors started handing out coils from the cart. Each rope was exactly the same length, marked with the Academy's emblem at even intervals, the outer sheath slightly textured for grip. When Evan's turn came, an instructor whose species he did not recognize held out a coil with thin metallic fingers. Cadet Evan Cole, the instructor said, reading from a slate. One standard survival rope, serial K793. Log receipt. Evan pressed his thumb to the slate, then hefted the rope in his hands. It had a satisfying weight without dragging him down, dense and flexible. He slid the coil over his shoulder in a practiced motion, letting the free end hang at his hip, and his brain immediately began measuring. Length versus average ledge spacing. Number of full wraps possible around a boulder of a given diameter. How much he could spare to build something that would stay behind while he moved on. Behind him, Ziri accepted her own rope as if it were a live toxin vial. She turned it over cautiously. This is madness, she muttered. Completely unassisted free movement in a canyon with nothing but a fiber cord? We will snap like larvae. You will not, Evan said. You have 4 hands. That is an unfair advantage, actually. Her frills twitched with reluctant amusement. You are strange, human. I suppose that is why the Academy keeps you around. Commander Rule's voice boomed again. You will be escorted by shuttle to Ingress Point 3. Once there, your individual timers will begin as you cross the start line. Environmental drones will monitor for lethal danger, but intervention will result in automatic failure. Do not rely on rescue. Rely on your minds. Evan rolled his shoulders, feeling the rope shift slightly against his back, a reassuring pressure. The plaza lights dimmed as shuttle assignments appeared on the overhead display. Evan's identifier flashed in the first wave. Ziri's appeared in the third. She gave him a sharp look. "You are going in before me," she said. "Good. Tell me if the canyon has decided to grow fangs since our last visit." "I will shout back if the rocks try to bite," he promised. "Watch the faces. The wind leaves clues." She shook her head, but some of the fear had drained from her posture. He knew she would be watching how he handled the challenge. Others would as well. Human improvisation had already become a quiet rumor on campus, a whispered explanation for his improbable scores in earlier practicals. Some cadets admired that. Some resented it. Rule, he suspected, simply wanted to see how far he could push it before it broke. As the first group moved toward the waiting shuttles, Evan fell into step, the hum of engines vibrating underfoot. Through the transparent corridor walls, he could see the canyon zone growing closer, the simulated sun angling just enough to cast harsh shadows into its depths. The cliffs looked even steeper up close, bands of color striping the rock where ancient sedimentary layers had been faithfully recreated. Dust plumes spun lazily from unseen ledges, marking the restless air currents that would shove at unwary climbers. The sight sent a shiver through him that was equal parts fear and thrill. For a heartbeat, memory layered itself over the view. He saw not alien cliffs, but the jagged coastline of home, the way storm waves had battered the rocks while his father shouted instruction over the roar of water. "Knots, boy. Knots are stories you tell the world with rope. Tell the right story, and the world holds you up instead of throwing you down." Evan tightened his grip on the coil. Here, in this artificial canyon, the story would be different, but the language would be the same. The shuttle doors cycled open with a hiss. The cadets filed in, harness clips unused and empty at their seats, a silent reminder of what they did not have this time. As Evan sat and buckled in, he unwound a short length of rope and began tying and untying a simple loop, letting his fingers remember the rhythm. Beside him, a scaled cadet watched in wary fascination. "What are you doing?" the cadet asked. "Greeting an old friend," Evan said. The engines flared, pressing him back in his seat as the shuttle lifted. Above the rising canyon walls, the training dome's artificial sun burned bright and indifferent. Rope slid over his knuckles, warm from his skin. One line, one tool. One chance to prove that sometimes the smallest issue of equipment could become an entire arsenal in the right hands. The shuttle touched down on the flat stone pad at the canyon's ingress point with a low thud that vibrated through Evan's boots. The doors slid open, releasing a blast of warm, mineral-rich air that carried the faint scent of dust and ozone. Heat radiated from the canyon walls, rising in shimmering waves as though the whole landscape breathed in slow, heavy pulses. Evan stepped out with the first wave of cadets, gripping his rope coil across his shoulder. The start line was painted directly onto the uneven ground, a bright streak that seemed fragile compared to the towering cliffs on either side. Beyond it lay a labyrinth of narrow ridges, boulder fields, and shadowed crevices. He felt the pulse of excitement beat beneath his ribs again. This part, the moment between the rules and the attempt, had always been his favorite. Instructor Rule stood near the start line, arms folded behind his back. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes tracked each cadet with cool calculation. A drone hovered above him, recording every heartbeat, every step. Evan nodded as he passed, and the commander gave the smallest inclination of his head in return. Approval or warning, Evan could not tell. It did not matter. The challenge waited. The timer on the display board blinked once. Evan inhaled sharply, let the breath settle, and stepped across the start line. The moment he crossed, the world narrowed to the canyon and the rope around his chest. The first section sloped downward into a wide saddle of fractured stone. The path was stable enough to walk, but the incline encouraged speed. Several cadets ahead broke into a jog, hoping to save precious minutes by rushing the easy terrain. Evan did not join them. He jogged only long enough to clear the shallow slope, then slowed as the path pinched into the first real obstacle, a series of irregular terraces rising in a jagged staircase. The cadets who had sprinted earlier began scrambling up the terraces. Most tried to climb directly, bracing hands on the hot rock, feet searching for holds. Evan watched one slip, recover, then continue with frantic effort. He shook his head softly. Good climbers moved like water, not like panicked insects. And none of these terraces needed to be climbed bare-handed. He pulled a length of rope free and looped it around his waist. The terraces varied in height, some chest-high, some over his head. He studied the arrangement, following the angles of the rock, the shadows, the distribution of cracks. He had seen similar formations on Earth, though not of this scale. It reminded him of the abandoned quarry near his hometown, where he had once built a ladder out of driftwood and torn tarp strips. This would be easier. He crouched near a patch of scattered branches blown in by canyon winds. Most were brittle, but he tested them one by one until he found several that held firm under pressure. He laid 2 longer branches parallel to each other, then lashed short ones between them with rapid knots, drawing tight loops with controlled tugs. His fingers worked from memory. The ladder was crude and lightweight, but it would hold under his weight. He tested a rung with his boot. It flexed, but did not break. Good enough. Some cadets stared down from the upper terrace, confused. A tall, red-skinned reptilian cadet frowned openly. "What is he doing?" he asked, no one in particular. Evan heard him but did not look up. He lifted the ladder and pressed it against the highest terrace. The soft rattle of knots tightening echoed off the stone. With practiced ease, he climbed, placing his weight carefully, trusting the pattern rather than the material. When he reached the top, he lifted the ladder again. The reptilian cadet backed away as Evan set it down beside him. "You could have climbed without that," the cadet said, half annoyed, half impressed. "I could have," Evan answered, coiling the unused part of the rope. "But this way uses less energy, and I might need my strength later." He moved on before the cadet could respond. The next section of canyon narrowed sharply, walls rising high enough to turn sound into strange echoes. A slanted slab blocked the center, forming a smooth ramp that offered no footholds. Several cadets were already trying to ascend it, sliding back repeatedly, frustration visible in every strained movement. A winged cadet beat her wings, attempting to lift herself, but the chaotic thermals knocked her sideways. She tumbled and had to be caught by another cadet. Evan scanned the slab and the surrounding walls. A narrow gap between 2 boulders caught his eye. A stable anchor point. He knelt, wrapped the rope once around the stone, tied a simple tension knot, and created a loop large enough to slip his foot into. A second loop followed higher up, then a third. He tested the anchor with his full weight. The rope tightened, gripping the stone with satisfying friction. With careful movements, he stepped into the first loop, then pulled himself up, sliding into the second. His hands kept the rope close to the rock to control the shift in weight. In moments, he reached the top of the slab. His shadow stretched across the path below. One cadet, a short, soft-furred creature, stared up at him with a baffled expression. "How did you know the stone would hold?" "I did not," Evan answered. "So I checked the cracks first. If the stone had shifted, I would have picked a different spot. But the rope could have slipped." "Not with this knot," Evan said. He moved on, not lingering for further questions. The terrain shifted again, flattening briefly before curving into a narrow ridge that extended like the spine of some massive fossilized creature. The ridge was barely wide enough for one boot at a time. A crosswind wailed through the canyon, buffeting harder than Evan expected. He crouched instinctively, balancing his center of gravity, studying the way dust moved along the ridge. The wind hit in pulses, not steady streams, predictable if he timed it right. Ahead, a cadet attempted to cross too soon. The wind shoved him sideways, and he flailed before dropping to his knees. He crawled forward, but the ridge trembled under him. Evan winced. Crawling would shift weight unpredictably and make him vulnerable. He decided on a different strategy. He uncoiled a section of rope, tied one end securely around his waist, and tossed the other end around a jagged outcrop on his side of the ridge. The anchor held. Then he wrapped the free rope loosely around his forearm, enough to steady his balance without risking entanglement. Each step across the ridge became a careful rhythm. Step, pause, lean into the wind, breathe, step again. Halfway across, the gusts strengthened. The rope tightened across his torso, holding him steady long enough for the wind to pass. He continued until he reached the other side. When he untied the rope, he noticed the cadet who had crawled earlier now watching him with wide eyes. "You used the rope for balance," the cadet said. "I did not know a simple line could work like that." "It is not simple," Evan replied. "It is whatever you make it." The cadet nodded slowly, absorbing the words as though they were some secret rule of survival he had never considered. Evan pressed onward. The canyon opened into a broad clearing layered with scattered stones and low pillars. The sun struck the area directly, heating the rocks until waves of heat distorted the air above them. He felt sweat forming beneath his collar. The beacon was still far ahead, but he could sense the terrain growing more complex, more dangerous. He welcomed it. He paused long enough to drink from the hydration node built into his uniform sleeve, then scanned the clearing. Ahead, 2 cadets attempted to scale a taller pillar using brute strength, but the surface was too smooth, too hot. One slipped, burning his palms, and cursed under his breath. Evan approached the pillar, placed a hand gently against its surface, and immediately withdrew. The heat was intense, hotter than stone should naturally be. Solar concentration from the canyon layout, he realized. He would not climb this directly. Instead, he surveyed the base and found cracks where smaller stones had lodged. Perfect wedges. He took his rope and ran it around the pillar, creating a friction wrap that hugged the smooth surface. As he pulled, the rope bit into the stone just enough to hold. He built a simple harness around his torso, clipped himself into the line with a pair of improvised knots, then began ascending by sliding the rope upward in small increments. The friction wrap tightened each time his weight shifted, letting him climb without touching the burning stone. A female cadet with pale bioluminescent markings stared up at him. "How is he doing that?" she whispered to her companion. Evan heard her, but he did not respond. His focus narrowed to the rhythm of movement. Push, tighten, breathe, inch upward. When he reached the top, he perched lightly, then scanned the path ahead. From this vantage point, he could see the next major obstacle, a broken ridge leading toward the deeper canyon. Good. He was making progress. He descended the pillar the same way he had climbed it, then retrieved his rope with a firm tug. As he coiled it neatly, he felt a small surge of satisfaction. He had used only a fraction of the rope so far, and he knew more sophisticated challenges waited ahead. The canyon wind shifted again, carrying faint voices from cadets behind him. Some sounded inspired, others frustrated. A few called out questions he did not stop to answer. He did not need to teach anyone. The canyon was the teacher. The rope was the lesson. He was simply fluent in its grammar. As he continued, the ground sloped downward into a narrow defile where shadows cooled the air. The noise of the world softened. His footsteps became quiet, purposeful. He adjusted the rope strap on his shoulder, letting the coil sit comfortably against his spine. The weight was small, but the potential inside it felt monumental, like a door waiting to be opened. Ahead, somewhere in the maze of cliffs and ridges, the beacon pulsed like a challenge thrown by an old rival. Evan smiled to himself. He was ready. The shadows deepened as Evan moved farther into the canyon, the air cooling enough to bring relief after the relentless heat of the exposed ridges. The walls rose in steep, almost vertical sheets of layered stone, each marked by smooth curves where ancient water flows had carved their paths. The deeper he went, the more the canyon seemed to swallow sound, replacing it with the soft whistle of distant drafts and the occasional rattle of pebbles disturbed by unseen creatures. He slowed his pace, letting his senses adjust. The defile ahead narrowed so tightly that only a single cadet could pass through at once. He paused before entering and traced the stone with his fingertips. The rock felt colder here, a sign that the sun never reached the inner floor. That usually meant moisture. Moisture meant moss. Moss meant possibility. Evan crouched and swept aside a patch of loose gravel to reveal a thin layer of pale green moss clinging to the shaded stone. The presence of moss confirmed his suspicion that the canyon's lower levels held microclimates different from the surface. It also gave him an idea. He stripped a small portion and squeezed it gently. Water beaded on his fingers. Not much, not enough to drink, but enough to tell him the air down here would be humid in pockets. Humidity could affect rope tension. Rope tension could affect anything he planned to build. Good. He needed to know the environment's rules before he used them. He eased deeper into the narrow defile, letting the walls close around him until his shoulders nearly brushed the stone. Then the defile opened abruptly into a wide chasm. The ground dropped into a steep, broken slope of loose rock. Far below, the canyon floor spread into a series of shelves separated by gaps too wide to jump and too unstable to climb without risking a collapse. Evan inhaled sharply. This was the section he remembered from the holographic map, a treacherous stretch where the Academy had intentionally destabilized the terrain. He saw the evidence at once: controlled fractures in the stone, subtle seams filled with pulverized dust, and strategically placed boulders that leaned just enough to threaten a landslide if disturbed. And farther ahead, past the broken shelves, the path narrowed to a single beam-like ridge no wider than his hand. Beyond that lay a collapsed stone bridge spanning a 30-meter drop. Two cadets stood at the edge of the broken slope, clearly trapped by the unstable ground. One, a slender, blue-furred creature, paced nervously. The other, a tall reptilian woman with a crest of gold scales, stared down with despair etched across her features. Both looked up when Evan approached. "It is impossible," the woman said sharply. "The shelves crumble at the slightest touch. My partner nearly fell through one." Evan knelt near the edge and tapped a protruding rock with the back of his hand. The stone shifted under the light pressure, sending a small cascade of dust downward. The female cadet's eyes widened. "Do not stand so close. The whole thing will collapse." "Not if I do not load it wrong," Evan replied calmly. He uncoiled his rope again and let it slide through his palms, weighing options. The shelves were unstable, but they were not entirely useless. He studied the way the cracks formed branching patterns across the slope. It reminded him of fractured ice he had once crossed on a frozen lake during a winter survival course. The trick had been distributing weight evenly. He could not step on the shelves, but he could distribute his weight in another way. First, he tied a long series of wide loops along one half of the rope, creating foot-sized openings spaced at regular intervals. Then he tied shorter loops between them, forming a mesh pattern. When he stretched the rope net across the slope, anchoring one end around a wedge of stone near the top, it settled lightly against the fragile shelves without applying concentrated pressure. He tied the far end to a heavier boulder on the other side of the slope, deliberately selecting one resting on a solid conjunction rather than a loose seam. The net sagged slightly, but that was expected. It did not need to be rigid. It only needed to spread his weight across enough surface area. The reptilian cadet stared. "You intend to walk on that?" "Not walk," Evan corrected. "Crawl." Before either cadet could argue, he gripped the rope net with both hands and lowered himself onto it. The net creaked softly but held. He distributed his weight carefully, crawling forward with smooth, measured movements. As long as he avoided sudden shifts, the shelves beneath would bear only diffuse pressure instead of the impact of direct footfalls. A few pebbles dislodged and skittered into the chasm, but the shelves themselves remained intact. When he reached the slope's edge, he pulled himself onto stable ground and secured the net with a secondary loop. The cadets behind him stared in stunned silence. "It is safe now," Evan said. "If you move like I did, steady even, no sudden lunges, you can cross without breaking anything." The blue-furred cadet tested the net with trembling hands. Evan watched carefully. The cadet's nervous grip was strong enough to distort the loops, so Evan intervened. "Use your palms, not your claws," Evan instructed gently. "Spread your weight out. Let the net do the work." It took several hesitant attempts, but both cadets managed to cross safely. The relief on their faces was immediate and overwhelming. "How did you know this would hold?" the female cadet asked. "I did not," Evan replied honestly. "But I understood the slope. It was not built to hold a direct load, so I changed the load." He retrieved the net by untying the anchor loops, then coiled his rope again. The cadets thanked him before continuing down their own path. Evan headed toward the next obstacle, the destroyed stone bridge. At first glance, the gap was too wide to cross by jumping and too deep to descend safely. The broken supports jutted from the cliffs like broken ribs. He approached the edge and studied the remnants. The canyon winds roared upward through the gap, powerful enough to tug his loose hair. Far below, faint scurrying noises echoed from creatures living in the dark crevices. Evan pulled the rope free again and assessed its full length. He did not intend to descend into the gap, but he needed to cross it somehow. The supports of the old bridge still reached far enough from each side to serve as anchor points. The gap itself curved slightly, forming a natural cradle for a suspended line. He tied a double bowline around the nearest support, ensuring the knot was tight enough that the fiber's friction locked it securely against the stone. Then he tossed the rest of the rope across the gap. For a moment the rope fell short, but a strong upward gust from the canyon carried it to the opposite support. Evan watched it flutter like a banner before settling against the stone. He grinned. The canyon winds had given him exactly what he needed. He retrieved the rope, looped it around the far support, and pulled both ends tight until the line stretched across the gap in a gentle arc. A simple rope bridge, primitive but reliable. He tested the tension. Then he placed his weight on the line, lowering himself into a hanging position and bracing his feet against the rope. With slow, controlled movements, he pulled himself across, hand over hand. Midway through, the wind surged again, but he adjusted his center of gravity and let the gust help carry him instead of fighting it. When he reached the far side, he climbed onto the broken support and retied the rope so it could be retrieved with a single pull. He tugged hard, and the rope slithered back across the chasm like a living thing before dropping neatly into his hand. He paused only long enough to breathe deeply, letting the canyon air fill his lungs. Further ahead, the terrain shifted again, this time hinting at something far more dangerous than unstable stone or broken bridges. Scattered tracks marked the sandy patches between rocks. They were small, clawed, and numerous. Canyon predators. Evan crouched and inspected one closely. A fresh print. The edges were crisp, not softened by wind. Something had passed through minutes ago. He straightened slowly. He did not fear the creatures, but he knew enough to respect anything that hunted in packs. The inhabitants of the canyon were opportunistic. They avoided large groups but stalked isolated cadets. He did not intend to fight them. He intended to discourage them. From a cluster of slender, flexible branches nearby, he built a small frame and stretched a thin sheet of rope fibers across it. He wove more strands through the sheet, creating a flat barrier with dangling ends that fluttered in the wind. A scent trap, not meant to catch predators, but to send a warning. Using a small amount of moss and dust, he rubbed the fibers until they carried a scent unpleasant to most canyon creatures, a trick he had learned during xenobiology training. He set the barrier at the edge of a narrow passage where the tracks converged. The wind carried the scent down the passage, spreading it far enough that any predator approaching would divert instinctively. A simple trap, but effective. When he finished, he tightened the rope coil on his shoulder and continued forward. He could already see a faint glimmer far ahead, a shimmer of light that might be sunlight reflecting off the beacon's casing. He was getting closer. The canyon felt more alive the deeper he went, humming with dangers he had not yet encountered. But every step he took carried the rhythm of purpose, the quiet certainty that all obstacles could be shaped into advantages. The rope brushed against his back like a silent partner. He touched it lightly. The tool had already become dozens of tools, and he knew he still had much more to build. Farther ahead, the path split into two diverging trails. Evan paused only long enough to assess the wind direction, the shadows, and the faint echoing growls from deeper tunnels. Then he chose the left path with calm deliberation and stepped forward, feeling the canyon tighten its hold around him as if preparing for the next challenge. He welcomed it. Evan followed the left path as it bent sharply between two towering walls of stone, the canyon narrowing until the sky became only a thin ribbon above his head. The air cooled again, carrying an earthy scent mixed with something metallic. He recognized the metallic trace immediately. High mineral concentration in the rock often meant sharper formations ahead, spires, needles, or fractured pillars that would complicate climbing. He slowed, letting his senses adjust, and listened. The canyon was quieter here, almost unnervingly so. No predator footsteps, no wind whistling through tight cracks, no gravel shifting in warning. Silence usually meant height. Height meant the next part of the trial was close. As he rounded a bend, the path widened abruptly into a vast inner chamber carved by natural forces. The chamber was shaped almost like a bowl, with steep ascending walls that converged at an impossible cliff face rising several dozen meters. The beacon shimmered near the top, its casing reflecting the artificial sun from the dome above. So this was the cliff he had glimpsed earlier. It was even steeper than the projections had suggested. Smooth as polished glass in some sections, fractured into sheer vertical stripes in others. The cracks offered potential holds, but the spacing was irregular and the top appeared unreachable without artificial help. Several cadets had already attempted the ascent. Some crouched near the base, shaking their hands after failed grabs. One cadet clung halfway up, struggling to maintain purchase before slipping and sliding down several meters, landing with a frustrated groan. Evan approached the cliff and traced one of the straight vertical seams with his fingertip. The crack was narrow, too narrow to fit his fingers, too shallow for a handhold. But the patterns intrigued him. The cracks were perfect climbing rails for someone who understood how to use them correctly. The problem was simple. The cliff surface lacked protrusions. But protrusions were not the only way to climb. He uncoiled his rope fully, spreading it across the ground to check for fraying or twists. It remained in excellent condition despite his earlier improvisations. The canyon had been kinder to the rope than to the cadets. He knelt and began tying a series of friction knots along one section of the rope. Prusik knots, 3 in total, spaced by careful measurement. The knots would grip the tensioned rope under weight, but slide freely when unweighted. A simple mechanism, but one of the most reliable in vertical ascension. Several cadets watched silently now. Even those who had been catching their breath paused to observe the human tying unfamiliar knots with quick, confident movements. Evan looked up at the cliff face again. He needed an anchor point. The top was too far to reach, and the walls to the side offered no ledges. But the cliff had small, uneven ridges near the middle. The ridges were not stable enough for climbing, but they could hold a pendulum anchor if the rope was thrown perfectly. He tied a heavy, roughly spherical stone to the rope's end. The weight was necessary to carry the rope to a high enough point before gravity pulled it downward. He measured the distance, adjusted his stance, and swung the rope in a wide arc once, twice, then hurled it upward with all his strength. The stone soared, trailing rope behind it, and struck the ridge with a loud crack. It rolled, dropped, caught against a protrusion, nearly slipped, then wedged firmly. Evan pulled hard to test the hold. The rope tightened, vibrating with tension but holding steady. A few cadets gasped softly. Evan wasted no time. He tied the anchored rope's loose end around his waist, using a reinforced figure-8 knot. Then he clipped 2 of the prusik loops onto the line, one for his hands, one for his feet. He tested them, shifting his weight carefully. The knots tightened exactly as intended. Good. He stepped into the lower loop, pulled himself upward, and slid the upper prusik higher. His ascent had begun. The cliff was unforgiving. Smooth stone pressed against his knees and elbows each time he shifted. The rope creaked under the repeated loading and unloading. But the friction knots did their work, gripping the line with stubborn precision. Evan felt the tension in his arms grow, but he controlled his breathing, tightening his core to keep himself vertical. Momentum would make the climb easier, but recklessness would ruin everything. Hand loop up, foot loop up, push, rest, repeat. Below him, cadets watched with a mixture of awe and disbelief. A few whispered to each other, though the words faded in the air. From the corner of his eye, Evan noticed that one male cadet attempted to mimic the knot pattern. Evan hoped he had paid enough attention. A wrong knot could slip under weight. Halfway up, the anchored ridge shifted slightly. The stone dipped, then lodged itself again. Evan froze, fingers tight around the upper prusik. He exhaled slowly. Sudden movements would unsettle the ridge even more. He leaned his weight into the line and checked the angle. The rope's position remained acceptable. He continued climbing with extra caution. Each movement sent tiny vibrations through the rope that hummed against the stone. When he reached the midsection of the cliff, the surface changed. The cracks widened, offering narrow shelves of stone where his boots could brace briefly. He used them only to rest his legs, never trusting the shelves enough to step fully. When he was close enough to the top to see the beacon clearly, he adjusted his grip and tested the last few meters. The ridge's anchor would not hold if he pulled sideways, so he climbed straight up, aligning his center of gravity with the rope. The final push required more strength than he expected. His arms burned. Sweat trickled down his back, making his uniform cling. But with a final upward swing of the hand loop, he lifted himself over the ledge, swung his leg onto solid ground, and rolled to safety. The beacon stood only a few paces away, attached to a simple bracket hammered into the stone. Its surface shimmered faintly, pulsing with timed signals. Evan approached and touched it. The indicator flashed green. His climb had been logged successfully. He turned and looked down. Several cadets stared up at him in utter shock. One female cadet with silver-patterned skin called out, "How did you make that climbing rig?" Evan held up the rope, the prusik loops dangling. "Friction knots," he said loudly enough for the echo to carry. "The rope does the work if you let it." He unlatched the beacon from its bracket and secured it in the chest compartment of his uniform. The hard part was complete, or at least the part that the instructors expected most cadets to fail. But he still needed to descend, and the descent would be just as dangerous as the climb. He set the rope over a natural stone horn on the cliff's edge and tied a controlled descent knot. Then he leaned back, letting the friction of the knot carry his weight smoothly as he lowered himself. The descent went faster, but he never rushed. When he reached the midpoint, he stopped and adjusted his angle to avoid sending falling stones onto the cadets below. As he approached the lower section, several cadets hurriedly stepped back to give him space. Evan landed softly, untied the rope from his waist, and coiled it again. The cadets' expressions ranged from admiration to disbelief. One male cadet approached him, voice trembling with frustration. "How did you know the ridge would hold? If it had slipped, you would have fallen." "I did not know," Evan answered simply. "I tested the angle, considered the weight, and trusted the rope to tell me if something was wrong." The cadet stared at him. "Trusted the rope? It is just a tool." Evan shook his head. "A rope listens if you know how to speak its language." With the beacon secured and the climb complete, he looked toward the canyon's exit route. Shadows stretched long across the chamber, and distant winds carried hints of sand. The final part of the trial waited beyond the next ridge. He tightened the rope coil on his shoulder, adjusted the beacon at his chest, and stepped toward the path leading out of the bowl-shaped chamber. He could feel the eyes of the cadets behind him, following him with a mixture of awe and expectation. He did not look back. He didn't need to. The next challenge would demand focus, and he welcomed it with steady, confident steps. Evan left the bowl-shaped chamber with the beacon secure against his chest, and the rope coil settled like a familiar weight across his shoulder. The path rising out of the chamber twisted sharply upward at first, then angled toward a jagged cut in the canyon wall where the exit corridor began. The artificial sun had shifted while he climbed, casting longer shadows that pooled in the cracks and made the stone look deeper than it was. The air felt drier up here, the heat returning as the canyon widened and allowed more light through. He quickened his pace. The timer on the inside of his visor display blinked a cold reminder of the remaining minutes. He still had enough, but not enough to waste on missteps. The route back to the extraction point did not follow the path he had taken in. The academy preferred that. The instructors wanted to know who adapted to a new route on the fly and who clung to familiar ground. Ahead, the floor of the canyon broke away into a descending maze of staggered ledges and vertical drops that formed a long descent toward a distant plateau. The plateau glowed faintly where the extraction beacon pulsed above it. Evan stood at the edge of the first drop and scanned downward. It looked like a giant had taken a chisel to the canyon, carving out platforms and leaving sheer faces between them. Some of the lower ledges sloped toward the void. Dust loosened at their edges, hinting at unstable footing. He could probably climb down piece by piece with the rope and some careful planning, but that would take time. He needed something faster, something that worked not just for him, but for the cadets who would reach this point after him, exhausted and pressed for seconds. He stepped back from the edge and looked around. The canyon floor near the drop was littered with fallen branches, gnarled fragments of a hardy plant species that had once clung to the cliffside. Most were dry but dense, twisted in strong patterns by years of wind and sand. Good material. He began selecting the strongest pieces, dropping them in a rough pile near the edge. A cluster of cadets reached the drop while he worked. He recognized the silver-patterned girl who had shouted up to him earlier at the cliff, as well as a compact winged cadet whose feathers lay flat with fatigue. Both stopped short when they saw the drop and the unstable sloping ledges below. The winged cadet lifted his gaze to the churning air. "The thermals are worse here," he said hoarsely. "I cannot glide that distance safely." "Then do not," Evan answered. "We will build a way down." The silver-patterned girl frowned. "With what?" "Branches and this," he said, touching the rope coil. He knelt and laid two of the thicker branches side by side, then lashed cross pieces between them at intervals, creating a rigid spine. He anchored the rope tightly around this framework, weaving it in a pattern that distributed tension evenly across the structure. The result was not quite a ladder and not quite a rope. It was something in between, a flexible descent line braced with a skeleton. The combined structure could hang without twisting, and the rungs would stay relatively horizontal instead of swinging wildly. He finished the top end with a thick anchor loop and searched for a reliable point to fasten it. A heavy rock spur jutted from the edge of the canyon lip, cracked but solid. He ran the anchor loop around the spur twice, pulled hard, and felt the line bite down until the rope fibers hummed. He eased his weight onto the first rung. The combined rig flexed, but the branches bore the load well. The rope hissed softly against the rock but did not slip. The cadets behind him watched, tense and silent. "I will go first," Evan said. "One at a time after that. Keep 3 points of contact as you move, and do not jump off the last rung. Step off." The silver-patterned girl nodded, swallowing hard. Evan climbed over the edge and descended, gripping the rope sides and planting his boots on each rung. The canyon wall loomed close. His shoulders brushed gritty stone. Below, the first ledge waited, far enough to break bones if he fell. The rig held, the branches creaking slightly but resisting the strain. He moved steadily, counting rungs, adjusting his body against each puff of unpredictable wind. When he reached the ledge, he stepped off exactly as he had instructed, then turned and pulled the line taut. "Your turn," he called up. The winged cadet came down first, awkward at the beginning, wings flaring instinctively until he forced them flat. Evan guided him with brief instructions, pointing out where to place his feet. The cadet reached the ledge, trembling but intact. Relief flooded his features. "I would never have thought of this," he admitted quietly. "You do not have to," Evan said. "You just have to be willing to use it when you see it." The silver-patterned girl followed, then two more cadets who had arrived in the meantime. Once all of them stood on the lower ledge, Evan braced the rig again. "We can move it," he said. "The next drop is shorter, but the slope beyond it is worse." He untied the anchor loop, coiled the top of the structure, and signaled to the others. Together, they lifted the branch and rope rig and carried it along the ledge to where the next drop yawned. This time, one of the cadets suggested a more secure anchor, pointing out a rock formation farther in. Evan tested it, agreed, and lashed the rig into place. The descent sequence repeated, faster and more fluid now that everyone understood the rhythm. With each rotation, the group moved as a single organism. Rig down, cadet down, rig retrieved, rig moved. They reached the lower shelves in a matter of minutes instead of the long, cautious climb it would have taken without the tool. The plateau lay closer now, its extraction beacon pulsing brighter. The last obstacle between the group and the plateau was a wide gap cut diagonally across the canyon floor, too far to jump and bordered by sandy slopes that crumbled near the edge. The kind of trap that invited desperate leaps and punished them. Evan stood at the brink and measured the distance with his eyes. The rope was still long enough to span the gap with room to spare if he used it efficiently. But a simple line would swing too much under the weight of a crossing cadet. He needed stability. He needed tension. He scanned the rock and found two sturdy pillars on either side of the gap, slightly offset from each other. Perfect. He ran the rope around one pillar and pulled it across to the opposite side, wrapping it around the second pillar and cinching it tight. Then he pulled with all his strength, using a leverage knot to increase the tension until the line became a firm horizontal span. He locked it in place with a final knot sequence that distributed stress evenly along the fibers. The result was a makeshift traverse line with minimal sag. He tested it himself. He clipped his harness loop into the line with a small knot, then hung beneath it and crossed hand over hand, bracing his boots lightly against the rope to control sway. The gap yawned below him, but the line remained firm. When he reached the far pillar, he swung himself up, unclipped, and landed with a soft thud. "You can cross," he called. "Use the line like you saw me do. Keep your grip steady, one at a time." The winged cadet volunteered to go first, perhaps emboldened by the earlier descent. He clipped in, then moved across the rope with careful, jerky motions. The line trembled under him, but Evan's knots held. He reached the far side, breathing hard, eyes wide. One by one, the others followed. Each crossing shook a little less as cadets adjusted to the technique. When the silver-patterned girl reached the far side, she paused beside Evan, staring back at the gap with an expression that mixed disbelief and dawning understanding. "All of this from one rope," she said. "I kept thinking of it as a lifeline or a tether, just a single use." "It can be a lifeline," Evan said, "but it can also be a path, or a wall, or a bridge. The difference is not in the rope." "Then where?" she asked. He tapped his temple lightly. "Here." A rustle of movement on the far side drew his attention. Another group of cadets had reached the gap, led by a familiar figure with luminous skin and 4 dark eyes. Ziri. She saw the rope bridge and then saw him. Her frills flared with visible relief. "You survived your climbing obsession," she called out. "Impressive." "You survived your anxiety," he called back. "More impressive." She snorted, then moved to the line. He watched her tie in with precise movements, her earlier fear tempered by new understanding. When she crossed, her body flowed rather than jerked, each motion controlled. She reached his side and unhooked herself, gaze flicking to the beacon at his chest. "So you reached it," she said softly. "I knew you would. Now let us see if we can return before the Academy decides we are canyon fossils." The group moved together across the last stretch toward the plateau. The terrain smoothed into a gentle incline, as if the canyon itself surrendered at the final distance. The extraction point rose ahead, marked by a metallic platform embedded in the stone and a tall beacon tower radiating a steady blue light. Instructors and drones waited near the platform's edge. A timer display hovered above them in holographic projection, counting down the remaining minutes for active cadets. Evan stepped onto the extraction platform. The beacon in his chest compartment pulsed once in response to a scan. The holographic display flashed his completion time. He exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders in a slow wave. He had done it. Around him, other cadets stumbled onto the platform in pairs and small clusters, some grim-faced, some laughing shakily, some too exhausted to show any emotion at all. Several had fashioned crude aids from their ropes, simple harness loops or basic anchors, but none carried a rope that looked as worn yet intact as his. Ziri joined him at the edge of the platform, chest rising and falling in measured breaths. Her gaze traveled over his rope, the scuffed branches tied into it, the knots that had been tightened and loosened repeatedly. "You used every length of that thing?" she said. "Almost," he answered. "I like to keep a little spare." Commander Rule stepped forward. The plaza's usual formality was softened here by dust and sweat, but his presence carried the same weight as always. He swept his eyes over the assembled cadets, then rested his gaze on the ropes coiled across shoulders and wrapped around waists. "The trial is complete," he said. "The canyon has recorded every decision each of you made. Your times, your safety margins, your choices of when to assist and when to conserve strength, all of it is now part of your record." A murmur rippled through the cadets. Rule raised a hand, and silence followed. "The purpose of this evaluation was not to measure who is strongest or fastest," he continued. "It was to see who understood what true survival requires. Many of you treated the rope as a restraint, a limitation, a single asset that forced you to move cautiously and accept narrow possibilities. Some of you treated it as a mere climbing aid. That is expected. You come from worlds where technology offers you anchors, pads, and powered gear. Your instinct is to rely on these things." His gaze shifted, settling briefly on Evan. "But a few of you saw something else. You understood that a tool is not defined by its usual use. A length of rope can be a ladder, a bridge, a barrier, a support, a trap, or a lifeline, depending solely on the mind that holds it. Resourcefulness is not about abundance. It is about imagination." Evan felt heat rise under his collar, not from the canyon this time, but from the awareness that Rule's words pointed at him as surely as a spotlight. Some cadets turned their heads subtly in his direction. Some looked with admiration, others with a hint of envy. Ziri's lips curved into a small, crooked smile. Rule continued, voice steady. "In cross-species teams, this kind of thinking is not optional. It is essential. You are here to learn from each other's instincts. Today, some of you saw an example of an instinct forged on a world where rope and gravity have been arguing for centuries. Study it, not to copy it exactly, but to understand how a familiar thing can be made unfamiliar in the best way." He gestured toward the canyon behind them. "In the field, you will rarely have the exact tools you want. You will often have just one cable, one vehicle, one power cell, one ally. Your survival will depend on your ability to see more than one path in that single resource." The extraction beacon dimmed slowly, signaling the official end of the evaluation. Drones began collecting data from each cadet's uniform. Rule dismissed the group with a final nod, and small clusters formed as cadets drifted toward the waiting shuttles. Some replayed their own choices out loud, others quietly compared methods. A few approached Evan with direct questions about specific knots and constructions. He answered briefly, demonstrating patterns with quick movements of his fingers. He did not glorify what he had done. He simply explained it. Ziri waited until most of the cadets had moved on before speaking. "You know this will change things," she said. "Next time the Academy hands out a single tool, half of the class will look at it differently." "Good," he replied. "That is the point." "Some will not like that you made them look slow," she added, eyes glinting with amusement. "You might have fewer fans among the high rankers." "I am not here to collect fans," he said. "I am here to learn how not to die on someone else's world." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That is an acceptable goal." The shuttle ride back to the main station passed in a blur of fatigue and quiet satisfaction. Evan sat with the rope coiled neatly on his lap, his fingers absently tracing the impressions left by knots he had tied and untied. Each mark felt like a sentence in a story written that day, a story about limitations that had turned into possibilities. When the shuttle docked and he stepped out onto the familiar red gravel of the assembly plaza, he glanced toward the canyon dome one last time. The cliffs stood silent and indifferent in the distance, but he knew the trial's record now lived in the Academy's data cores, and, more importantly, in the cadets' memories. In the weeks that followed, he saw subtle changes. In training yards, cadets tied more elaborate knots instead of relying solely on magnetic clamps. In simulation domes, instructors posed new questions about single-tool scenarios, and discussions lingered longer than before. He heard his name mentioned sometimes, but he did not chase the sound. He continued to train, to experiment, to refine the quiet partnership between his hands and whatever tools he held. The rope hung above his bunk now, a simple gray coil on a metal hook, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. He had taken a single-issued line and turned it into ladders, nets, traps, bridges, and a climbing rig. The canyon had tried to insist that one was not enough. He had answered by proving that one, in the right mind, could be many. The Academy moved on to other trials, other worlds, other challenges. Yet the lesson of the rope lingered, woven into the fabric of every new evaluation. Cadets arrived whispering rumors of the human who talked about tools as if they could listen. Some came to him for advice. Some watched from a distance. Some tried to outdo him. He welcomed all of it. He knew that one day, far from the safety of Station Helix, on a real mission under a sky that was not simulated, someone would face a chasm or a cliff or a disaster with only one resource at hand. If that person paused, looked at that single tool, and saw not a limitation, but a starting point, then the trial in the canyon would have done more than test scores. It would have planted something that could keep that person alive. On a quiet night cycle, as the artificial stars glowed softly against the dome overhead, Evan lay in his bunk and looked at the rope above him. He smiled to himself, a small, tired, contented curve of the mouth. The Academy had given everyone one rope. He had answered by building far more than the instructors expected. Not just ladders or rigs, but a different way to look at every problem that came after. That, he decided, was enough.